What I have for you, we'll be talking about environment at kind of multiple scales and how we might think about designing for folks. And probably the key takeaways will be mostly in the theoretical realm. A couple of theoretical frameworks that might help you think about some ways of attacking some problems. But what's always useful is, why is healthy aging an issue? And why have we chosen to live in these types of environments, right? This has really been our development pattern for really since post-World War II, right? So 70 years. This is the kind of model that that we've been living in. And there is a reason why we do this, and we'll talk about why. But first, let's talk about what are some of the consequences of this. So if we take a look at the issue of obesity, for instance, and what I'd like you to take a look at is like 1990, if you notice, no states beyond even 20%, right? We're generally in kind of that 10 to 15 range. By 2003, you're starting to see states 25%. If we just take a look at the baby boomers over there on the right, now we're in purple, right? They came up with a new color, purple. We're at 40 to 45%. Think about how rapidly that changes, right? We're talking about probably a little bit more than your lifetime. And we've gone from 10 to 15% on average to now we have states over 40%. It's a dramatic change, right? And our lifestyle choices, which involve the environment, are partly responsible for that. Something else that affects our life is actually greenhouse gases and air pollution. Not surprisingly, if we live in suburbs, guess what we do? We're bigger producers of that kind of pollution. And we see it hold up. So Chicago's not an outlier. We see it in Atlanta. I like to show San Francisco because you can actually see the effectiveness of the BART system to reduce, right? Where that's connected, you begin to see people producing less greenhouse gas. But we have chosen to create an environment in which we do this, right? We're sitting in our cars, we're trafficked, look at the air quality that we produce. Now, we have also chosen to create an environment like this. Certainly not walkable at all, right? You are car dependent at this point. Also probably says something about our diet, right? If you take a look what's there. And so in all sorts of ways, what we've done is we moved to a system that creates a whole set of chronic stress on us. Whether it's air pollution, whether it's obesity, whether it's in our food diet and so forth. There's all sorts of stresses. And I think a useful model I have found to try to link my work with some work in the health sciences is actually the model of allostatic load. If any of you have heard about this. So essentially the idea of this model is that our body is set up to respond to acute stresses, right? A bear's chasing me. What do I do? Okay, and your hormones kick in and so forth. So our body's set up for that. But those really aren't the stresses that we're experiencing now. We're not having too many acute stresses. We're having all sorts of chronic stresses. And so there's these hormones that kick in and so forth, and essentially don't kick off. And that begins to have some meaningful health responses. So stress is going to be a big concept as we move through the rest of this presentation. So we know there's suggestions that the way we've chosen to live, our environmental choices, actually drive chronic disease. We've created a perfect petri dish for what's called the Western disease cluster. So if we take a look at some of the factors, our food systems, and we'll talk about food deserts in a bit, emissions, chemicals, how we've chosen to transport, construction, and so forth, change the pathways that the allostatic load theory would suggest, inflammation, oxidative stress, so there's that key word of stress again. Those are really important pathways to take a look at that then are linked to the Western disease cluster of obesity, metabolic syndrome, which Diane mentioned I take a look at, all the way down to Alzheimer's disease, right? And really some profound work over the last couple years coming out of LA is how air pollution seems to be influencing the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. We think about it in the genetic realm, right? But genes go on and off, right? How they're switched on, and air pollution seems to be a big factor in that. My work has taken a look at other neighborhood kind of factors related to dementia and its progression. So some recent work has been to take a look at what's called the connectivity of a neighborhood. So essentially, if you take a look at kind of downtown environments, right, grid patterns, multiple choices to get to whatever store or restaurant you're trying to get to, those are more connective kind of neighborhoods. While our suburban neighborhoods, chances are maybe you have one choice, maybe you can't walk at all because maybe there's not sidewalks, right? Very limited. So if you think about that just in terms of connectivity, what we've seen is if you're in a more connected neighborhood, so a more kind of typical urban environment, the progression of dementia is slower, and vice versa. So a suburban environment tends to increase the decline in dementia. Now we think there's two pathways to that. We think one is physical activity, influencing people's health. We think the second is social isolation. But the manner in which we're choosing to live, essentially what architecture and urban design is about, is organizing our social life, how we're making those choices. And so it has a profound effect in terms of what we begin to see. So we know that there's these negative outcomes, particularly as with an aging society, and we see more chronic kinds of diseases. So why do we continue to choose to live in these environments, and why have we done it in the past? And I think it's important to recognize why. So one of my favorite museums in the world is the New York Tenement Museum. It's in New York City, and it tells the story of New York life right before the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So it really tries to focus on 1880s New York City. And we can begin to understand where the suburban environment came from. So New York at the time swelled to a density of 453 people per acre. Okay, abstract number. What does that mean? How many of you know Seattle? Yeah? 12 people per acre. 453 people per acre. Okay? Incredibly dense environment, incredibly crowded. That's really what the term slum means, by the way. We give other connotations, but really it was the notion of density. So, New York City created all sorts of what at the time would have been considered high density apartments. So tenement buildings were built. They had 4 apartments per 5 floors, so 20 apartments. Generally speaking, in those apartments, there'd be the 2 parents and probably 3 to 4 children in there. So you're talking about a building that probably held about 100 people. And what was the urban condition? The urban condition was, well, they were served by 3 outhouses, these buildings. 100 people, 3 outhouses. The living room in the front window would be the only one with daylight. And then it would pass through the kitchen, dining, back to the bedroom. And that's essentially what these were 3-room apartments. And again, 5 to 6 people living in there, okay? So we need to understand kind of the urban condition that our suburban environment responds to. There was no running water. Water was sourced, and in the city's wisdom, it was sourced right by the outhouses, right? So you had acute health conditions that were happening there in the city. And so you're like, well, okay, so the indoor environment wasn't necessarily so great. What else could you explore? Maybe the outdoors, right? Well, what was the outdoors at the time? Well, this is what we were doing with our outdoor environment. Okay, this is Pittsburgh. And one of my favorite slides is this is actually St. Louis. Hopefully you can see that the street lights are on. Do you have a sense of what that bright thing up kind of towards the top is?
Sun.
It's the sun.
Oh.
This is midday St. Louis. Okay? So this was what our outdoor environment was. So there was a whole reason why the notion was what we need, what they identified as the design solution actually identifies the problem, right? We want to get away from, or create a group of slumless, so not as dense, smokeless cities, right? And how would you begin to do that? Well, you begin to separate functions of what was going to happen where. You create green space. And the logical extension of that zoning and the need for green space and separating things out was actually our suburban environment. That's what we ended up creating. And so we were trying to respond to the acute healthcare conditions of an urban environment with a suburban environment that now we know exacerbates chronic conditions. So let's try and tie this back to aging at this point. So one of the things that's happened over time is we're really good in terms of kind of economic innovation in this country. And so there's this notion in economics and in urban planning where as a business, there's a certain threshold, a density of people that you need to run your business. You know, if you're owning a hardware store or what have you. And then the range is how far will people travel to get to there. And as long as the range is longer than your threshold, your business should be good to go. Something that's called the Walmart effect is, hey, let's try and get that threshold and range to be about the same. Because then if we can have pressure points, any competition within that range, we can begin to get rid of. So that was the whole notion. And so we have longer ways to go to stores and so forth that give us greater choice and typically less expensive items. This has a profound effect in terms of aging, because there's a range of work over decades that the home range of older adults shrinks over time. The ability to travel begins to shrink. And there's all sorts of reasons for this, okay? So we can take a look at physical. So if we're just talking about where we could walk if we want to, we have musculoskeletal issues you probably have talked about, endurance, kind of chronic pain issues. If we talk about driving, we're in a car-dependent society. We know the sensory acuity can begin to drop. One of the things you might recognize in let's say, grandparents or uncles or something is reaction time. So you might be at a stoplight and you're like, well, or a stop sign, why aren't we taking this turn, right? The person's way off. And it's because of that sense of reaction time, okay? They tend to be a little bit more hesitant in that. And then there's the loss of social networks, other social dimensions here that begin to shrink the home range. Okay, thought I had another slide there. There is an effect of that in terms of creating food deserts for people. So a lot of times, because their home range is shrunk, they are now in an area where they cannot get to a grocery store that has healthy food options. There's an economic impact to that too. If where you're shopping tends to be the 7-Eleven or what have you for your daily groceries, it impacts the amount you're spending on food about 50%. You're spending about 50% more your food budget if you're in a food desert. So, how do we foster healthy aging? And this is from WHO, the World Health Organization. This is how they define healthy aging. Process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being and aging. And that's really where design work in architecture and urban design have tended to focus. I really like the chart that they developed. This is from 2015. And the reason I like it is you can go through a literature for decades and really the environment's almost silent in many of the things from the World Health Organization. All of a sudden it pops up as important, as critical, and in two ways. How do we promote capacity? Okay, so that's the positive aspect. And then how do we really think about how we're removing barriers? Right, so there's two dimensions to it. Sometimes what we design can get in the way. Right? And we need to think about how we remove those barriers. And sometimes we can make design innovations that promote capacity. And hopefully you'll see that in the rest of the slides. So this is one of the theories that I think might help you out as you think about interventions in the home. Okay? How many of you have seen this, if at all? Not familiar? Okay. So this is the ecological model of aging by a psychologist, environmental psychologist named Powell Lawton. Okay? Let's walk through it. On the y-axis is individual competence, okay? And on the x-axis is environmental press. How demanding is the environment of you to navigate? Is it really complex? Is it really difficult? It goes to the right side. If it's really easy, essentially the environment's taking care of things for you, you're way on the left side. So let's walk through kind of what this looks like. So, let's say we happen to be in an environment, things change, right? Things are dynamic, these systems, they're not static. And so let's say we're in an environment and we're really working very creatively, right? Whatever the workspace is, maybe here in the lab, you're really working. And then all of a sudden, you have a colleague comes in and starts singing a really bad song, right? Roxanne, right? Okay. All of a sudden, the stress of the environment has probably gone up, right? And you may not be as creative, that zone of maximum potential, and you might actually begin to have some negative affect, like, I don't want to be here, right, with this guy belting out the police. So that can begin to happen. Now, another thing that can happen is that our individual competence drops too. You might notice perhaps you're not quite as effective doing whatever your task is at 2 in the morning as you are maybe at 8 in the morning, or whatever type of person you tend to be. And often we push it, and often we can begin to have negative outcomes as well. And this is very much true for older adults and people that have challenges to their competence, let's say dementia. So this is a very useful framework to begin to take a look at, because where we really want people to be is either in that zone of comfort or that zone of potential, depending on kind of what we're looking for. The other thing I want you to take away with this then is we all assume, typically as designers, that everybody's operating at the high end. We walk in typically with that assumption that they're like us, right? And so this range of environment that people can operate successfully in is pretty wide because we can adapt. But people that have dropped competence in whatever range, physical ability, cognitive ability, have a much narrower range, right? And so it's our responsibility as designers to be much more honed in to what that range is and what can they accommodate. Really a profound model here. And so there are some architects that I think are wonderful museum designers. I would never want them to design a home for somebody with dementia, okay? Because they're not going to be able to adapt to that narrower range. They continue to think at this wider range. And so they would be the wrong type of architect to pick for that type of intervention. Speaking of dementia, something that builds off of this notion of environmental press or stress is a model called the progressively lowered stress threshold. So this is something that's really influenced my work in designing for people with dementia. And the notion is that there are kind of thresholds, okay? And you begin to see anxious behavior before you begin to see people move past the stress threshold. So caregivers will utilize this, let's say nursing or care assistants, and hopefully have a model where if they begin to observe anxious behavior, some intervention is triggered before that stress threshold is crossed, and some real negative outcomes begin to happen. This shows it as just kind of almost a continuous line. There's actually like peaks and valleys through the day, right? And there's effects to this depending on what's happening. What's kind of key is, can you keep them below that stress threshold before something negative really begins to happen? One of the things with people with dementia that's interesting is the way they exhibit anxiety isn't necessarily the way everybody does it. So one of the common ones I've actually seen, like in adult day centers, is behavior that is just like, let's see if I can do it, that's just like this. Okay, a repetitive behavior, making a noise, that's anxiety, agitation. Probably getting you anxious and agitated right now, right? So, so sometimes the behaviors are really subtle, right? And you have to be aware of what's happening there. But really important to identify, because you don't want them getting to the point where, because they're overstressed, you have some kind of real either physical or verbal types of issues. One of the things we do is we need to kind of, as I said, talk about this range that we want to be in for the environment. And even when we are purposefully designing for older adults and people with dementia, we still can end up with environments that are like this. Okay, this is an adult daycare. And you probably can ask yourself, what the heck is going on there? Right? What is the activity? What is the role you're supposed to be playing? And I can't blame this lady for tuning out right in the front, right? I don't know what's going on. I'll take some Z's, right? I mean, if I can. We create these environments that are very difficult to understand. And so that alignment between activity, the physical design, and the needs of people is really quite important. Now, one of the things that has been critiqued about the competence press model is that it misses the powerful social role, socio-cultural assumptions of place. And so what that is essentially about is we typically want to do what's expected of us as people. We want to play the right social role. So in this class, it seems like you're all focused towards the slides. Somehow you knew that. My guess is it's because you've experienced a classroom like this before, right? And you've created those kind of understandings about what happens here. We do that with all sorts of places. We make assumptions about what's supposed to be happening there. So when we create a convoluted environment like we just saw, it's not healthy for us, let alone somebody with dementia that's kind of struggling how to orient themselves in any case. So as designers, something that we've been using over the last decade or so is something called the ecological framework of place. And we tried to come up with something that really has all P's so it's easy to remember. So we define places involving people and physical setting, but also the notion of a program, the notion of what are the expectations that we want to occur within that physical setting. And those can change over time. So McDonald's can feel very different at 4 in the afternoon when you start to have your seniors come in, your older adults come in, right? Than it is 10 or 11 at night when perhaps it's the high school students that are occupying the McDonald's, right? So these change over time, and we need to be aware of that. But it's really helpful to begin to think about this because when you just think about people in physical setting, you typically think about people's needs, and you're not necessarily thinking about the social context within which they're operating. So the idea of program is critical. And I think that's particularly relevant when we talk about technology, to be quite honest with you, because there is research out there about who adopts technology, who's willing to adopt that. And there are some differences depending on social roles. I would have you take a look at kind of gender issues related to that. So there are factors to that as designers you want to really begin to think about. Who's more likely to utilize whatever technology you might be developing? Andy Sharlock is a social worker, so he didn't like the integrated model, and so what we developed was, okay, what if we piece it apart? How do these different things affect one another? And so this is a model we just had published in the handbooks of theories of aging, or the handbook. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you take a look at the right, and we'll revisit this concept of attributes in a bit, you essentially have to know what are you trying to design for? What are the goals, right? What are you trying to achieve? And from Andy's work that he's developed over the years, he's defined kind of 6 needs for older adults, all with C's that you see over there. And I have some slides if we have time later on that I can show you. I don't want to focus too much on these at this point. But that's a really important concept. You have to clearly identify what are the goals you're trying to achieve. What's critical about those 6, though, is that they do demand agency from people. Are you empowered to take that action? Do you have the intentionality? Do you have the ability to self-reflect about your capabilities? And that's also another issue with people with dementia, is the whole threshold of initiation of activity. Who's going to start a certain activity? So what we often will see with like dining, for instance, when there's a dietary problem, is often if you can get them to start. So often a caregiver in, let's say, an assisted living might begin to help them, with their first bite, and then it tends to take over. But if you don't have that support, that initiation doesn't occur, or it may not occur. So that's an important one. Sequencing, really critical when you're talking about technology. One of the key issues with people with dementia is, how many choice points, if you will, are there along the way that they have to make? Because they're more likely to make an error, quite simply. And so its executive function is kind of the term that's often used in psychology for that. And how do you begin to understand that and try and rectify that? And then the idea of directed attention. So that's the ability to focus on a task. Again, whether we're tired as a healthy aging person or have other stresses that are addressing it, or people with dementia, their cognitive capacities challenge directed attention. So places can be sources of stress for them. It can be stressful in terms of testing their capacity. It can be source of stress in terms of program. What if they can't do what they want to be able to do? If the environment doesn't allow that. Do they play a meaningful role in that activity? So one of the things we'll often critique in larger environments, for instance, is, they'll create activities of like fishing over a screen, okay, and you get some kind of prize on the end. So they'll develop a thing like that. If you really think about it, there's the staff person who's giving the prize. There's maybe the staff person that's helping the person, and the person kind of doing the fishing over the wall. That's really the roles, and everybody else is just kind of watching, and I don't know, I think I'd turn the channel if it was on TV, right? So it's not the most exciting thing. So there is no role to play. If we're creating environments or activities that people have no role, why would we expect them to engage? Right? We're telling them not to, essentially. The physical setting, we talked about the importance of barriers or facilitators, and we're just about to launch into doing taking a look at how we design for folks. And then the issue of time is really important. So if something is too apparently complex or not necessarily of direct value, there is a theory in gerontology that takes a look at kind of the time horizons, as the investments older adults are likely to make are more in those things that are emotionally meaningful to them. Okay, and so that's an important characteristic too. And then of course the whole idea of effort. Okay, so the way we approach this, so I don't know if you noticed, but the blue fonts become gold, and we're now going to talk about, okay, how do we design? And so the kind of the underlying concept is a theory called inclusive design. This has evolved from accessibility was initially kind of the term, and that became universal design, and it was talking about what the environment should have. And we can talk about ramps and things of that sort, right? Inclusive design realizes that that's really not enough. What we need to do is rethink the process of design, because often what we were doing is we were just tacking something on to a building that we would design. Tack on a ramp, boom, boom, we're good to go. It's not the same. So if in the process we think about enabling and empowering a diverse population, focus on human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. Those are really the themes of inclusive design. 7 principles help lead to that. So equitable use, think about a range of users and their capabilities. How can you enable that? Flexibility in use. I'll focus a little bit more on simple and intuitive use, so that ready recognition of what to do is critical. If it takes too many multiple steps, and depending on your population, how many steps is kind of critical to try and aim for, it's an absolutely critical component, because they may completely bypass the system if it's too complex. Perceptible information, can they understand what to do with it? So, I can tell you, one of the struggles I have in video games, my son kicks my butt all the time in video games, okay? Why? Because we'll open a game and he'll start popping at the screen, right? Boom, 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 doing whatever. And I'm like, why are you doing that? And he's like, well, that's the way it works. How do you know that's the way it works? Right? There were no instructions here. So, well, that's the way the game works. And so for me, it was not perceptible information. For him, it was native, right, of what you do. So you have to understand who you're trying to serve and what they might perceive. Tolerance for error, really important in an aging population. Probably the easiest way to think about this is just in terms of physical capabilities. So if you can begin to think about getting older, perhaps let's say maybe beginning to have arthritis or something, what you might be able to navigate with your finger, what you might be able to grab, probably changes, right? And so if you're designing something for older adults, you need to begin to understand that those are probably some likely things that are beginning to happen. Low physical effort. So is it too hard physically to design for? And the size and space for approach and use. Not everybody's the same. Not everybody has the same capabilities. And so to be thinking about who you're accommodating is really absolutely critical. So what are some of the things we do in the dwelling, which is where you're focused? One of the concepts is visitability in the home. Have you heard about this concept at all yet? No? Okay, good. So visitability, we'll talk about the principles in a bit, but it's essentially the concept of anyone ought to be able to visit anyone else's home. If you can just kind of get that in your head as a takeaway. So what I'm showing you here is a pretty traditional kind of looking house, right? But actually, if you notice, there's a subtle ramp that's beginning to go beyond, behind those bollards, and there's a couple steps, and it continues to ramp around the house so it can begin to allow somebody in. That's one possible solution, as a ramp. Here's another inventive one. This is a home in Wyoming, if I remember correctly, where when the wife ended up in a wheelchair, they actually built a little space out front and made it a gallery, right? So this is where art lovers, this is where they begin to express some display. So it's not just a ramp, right? It begins to be a place of meaning for them as well, beyond accessibility. So here are the principles. At least one no-step entrance to the home. Accessible doors and hallways. So generally we're taking a look at wheelchairs, typically 36 inches wide. But what we have to understand as designers is wheelchairs are changing all the time. So you probably see wheelchairs now that have some of the angled wheels to them. Okay, that might be changing the proportions, dimensions that we need. Increasingly motorized, how is that changing? So we need to think about some of those things. Accessible first floor half bath, and a room that could serve as a bedroom on the first floor. How many of you seen, a grandparent or something end up kind of being in a bed in the living room, for instance? Any of you yet? Okay, it'll be coming down the pike if you haven't. Very common. We'll show you how we address this in a bit. And then really quite simply all we're asking for right now as an industry is reinforcing bathroom walls when you build a home. Because you probably want to put in grab bars sometime. If they're already in the walls, you save a lot of time. And all that's doing, for those of you guys that sling hammers at all, you're putting a piece of wood right at the right height, nailing it in, and then putting your drywall over it. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. So we ask for that. This is a visitable home. Looks like a typical home to me, right? But it's visitable. All that's really changed about this design is that, of course, there's that flush entry to the front. Now, another important point for older adults is actually, hopefully you can kind of see that semi-private space before the front door. One of the ideas we will often have with older adults, and it gets heightened with people with dementia, is we try and grab onto the concept of the soft transition so that they don't necessarily have to fully commit to any kind of activity before they decide to. So in this particular case, before they would let someone visit, they have the chance at the door to just gauge who that person is. So someone just can't enter that door, and it's even better if there's like a foyer or something beyond that door. So soft transitions becomes an important concept. Here's a very typical floor plan. Essentially, it's designed initially to be an office on the first floor, but could be a bedroom right by the bathroom. That's really all you're doing. So that it's designed for that purpose. Bathroom, hopefully it has a shower or some kind of ability to bathe in there. But outside of that, that's really all that visitability talks about. There's more technical aspects of what we like in the bathroom. So you see the green thing is the reinforced wall. You can begin to see allowing under the sink the ability to pull a wheelchair. If kind of the ideal scenario is to allow for shower and tub. I've never quite personally gotten used to that, but you see it a lot in houses, I'll tell you that, people doing this. So people are making those expenditures anyway. But you can begin to see some of the things that they're doing. Probably the most inventive thing about the tub is you can see a standard tub, and they've simply put a space behind it, where if you think about being in a wheelchair later on, you might be able to sit and then swing your legs over into the tub, right? So there's a place to sit, and it looks pretty natural in order to do that. So those are some things. Grab bars don't have to be those stainless steel things that we see everywhere, okay? We can provide for it in other ways. This is a Kohler invention, matches their tiles that they want within showers and works pretty effectively. We can think about other functions. So here's this idea of dealing with tolerance and error. This is a faucet where you can set the temperature. Now in order to turn it on, all you do is touch it, right? Turn it off, touch it. So all of a sudden, a lot of those issues of dexterity might begin to disappear to some degree. This was this is not necessarily a design intervention, but a concept I wanted to tell you about. So, and again, with grandparents, you probably have recognized this. Have you heard about the concept of a control center? No? Okay. So, what you'll often see, and you've probably experienced it with grandparents, is you might notice that grandpa or grandma have a favorite chair. Ever notice that? Okay. Ever notice what tends to be around that favorite chair? So in this case, you have a phone, you've got the remote, you've got things to read, right? It's this shrinking home range, right? It's this miniaturization of social life. And they like to have control in that spot. So ideally, you actually have from it a view as well. And so often they'll place it somewhere where if they can get a view, they'll try and get a view. That personal control aspect of older adults, I think it's something as people interested in technology, you really want to hold on to and understand. That is likely where kind of their power center is, and how do you respond to that? Okay. Other things that we often forget about. Coming up with models or theories is a really useful way, I think, for designers to think about a problem. What are you trying to do? And so in this case, we're actually taking a look at outdoor environments. We were challenged to take a look at restorative gardens. And what are we really trying to restore? And we came up with the idea that it's directed attention. It's that fatigue aspect of focus, that if we can get people to be in a pleasant outdoor environment, that directed attention ability is likely to be resuscitated to some degree. And we do that naturally, right? I mean, chances are, because this is an internal room, I'm guessing when this class is done, you probably head towards the outside, look for a window, right? I'm guessing that's probably what happens. We do it in conferences all the time. We naturally take a look at a way to kind of restore ourselves. So if we can address directed attention fatigue, if we have that fatigue, we have increased stress, we see the negative behavioral manifestations. So I'm going to show you a couple of approaches to how we designed. That the idea was, okay, we restore the attention, we reduce the stress, and we see the less negative behavioral manifestations. So this is in a private residence. This was drawing upon the idea that the wife had actually come from Japan and trying to build off Japanese garden design. This is a slot of space, okay? So not necessarily, landscape architects would not necessarily love this, you know, that's what they ended up with. But it's the idea of how do you begin to respond in some way where it's a pleasant environment someone can go out to. So this is just very much about almost a passive engagement with it. You can also do active garden design. So how do you begin to enable gardening for people that begin to have some physical limitations? So raised beds is a wonderful thing to do. You can begin to think about, can someone pull a wheelchair underneath that raised bed? Things of that sort that you can begin to think about. Enabling ability. Some themes I want to hit from the institutional level is one of the things that I think is important in the technological realm is that idea of how many choice points are you providing people? How readily evident is it of what needs to happen? So this is our typical nursing home, a little bit dressed up. It's got carpeting on the floor and some other things, but a very typical nursing home, typically 100 feet from one end to the nursing station, and then there'd be the same on the other side. And what we have to begin to understand is if we happen to be in one of those rooms, there's a choice point of whether I go left or I go right. And let's say I'm trying to get to the nurse, just to make it easy. If I make the wrong choice there, I'm way off, right? I've totally goofed this up. Okay, those are the types of things, particularly with people with dementia, that really need to be scaffolded. How can you make it as readily apparent as we can? And so we'll show you what we try and do in just a second. One of the things we try and do is shorten any kind of travel distance. That's just based on physical ability. So how far can we go before someone has a chance to sit? We try and keep it to about 30 feet. And we try and array our rooms. You see this more and more in assisted livings. We try and array our private rooms around the social space. The dining, kitchen, family room, right? Readily recognizable. Hopefully they smell cookies or coffee or what have you, right? And boom, that triggers it too. So immediately accessible. They're not in this situation. They make a wrong decision. Everything looks the same. Boom, who knows where they're off to. And then we do the wonderful thing in nursing homes where typically we do what's called alphabet soup. We'll take that row and then we'll just multiply them, right? So we'll put one next to the other and you could be way off if you make that initial decision incorrectly. Some other issues that would be wonderful to take a look at in smart homes as well. Huge issue, I don't think we nearly deal with this as much as we need to in assisted livings and things of that sort, is lighting. The importance of circadian rhythm for older adults. How do we get that exposure to daylight? You can see there's actually a study about over 98% of time spent indoors. At least the time I've spent in skilled nursing facilities, I'd say there's a whole bunch that are 100% indoors, but we'll go with the 98. And we know that the low light levels correlate with higher agitation levels. Okay, so we light inappropriately and then we don't give exposure to daylight. Huge issue. How can we get people into daylight for the health benefits? Small group size is really important. We're trying to control the amount of stimulation that they have and make it as appropriate. So we know that smaller units are associated with lower agitation, fewer emotional disturbances, less use of psychotropic drugs. Good for us, not so good for Merck, but good for us. But the big question remains, what is a small group size? What is what we're trying to design for? And you see a range there. Generally now you're seeing more like around 12. 11 and 12 tends to be kind of the norm. Here's one that's 9. This is one I consulted on in Philadelphia. And just to give you a sense of what we're doing. So here you can hopefully see we've tried to get 9 private rooms arrayed around the activity space. It's called the cluster den there. The slot of space that you see kind of going vertically there was idealized to be a dining room for those 9. At pretty much the last minute, the organization decided they didn't have the guts to go for that. So you'll actually see the dining room down in the lower right. They wanted something centralized that they could begin to use. So that we couldn't quite get them across that hurdle. And we can talk about why later on. But hopefully you'll also see that the nurses' station is very different. It's just a residential desk right in that slot of space. It says caregivers. That's all there is to the nurses' station at that point. And then there's locked cabinets up above. One of the other important things is, you know, when we design for 36, 40 people in typical nursing homes, if we have activities for that, people are not going to have a sense of what's going on. We know from their likely visual acuity, certainly their hearing acuity, how are they possibly going to engage? So we know we need to keep it to about a 12-foot diameter, and if we just kind of array chairs around a circle, we know that's a group of about 12 max. We shouldn't even be thinking about having activities of more people than that because they're not going to be able to engage. So it's always interesting to me. You'll see activities like the daily newspaper in places, and they'll be in a group like this, and they'll say, okay, well, here's the story, and it's like, by the time you're 12, 15 feet away, there's no way you have any idea even what the headline is. You know, you don't have the visual acuity. How can you possibly engage in that activity? Ease of orientation is an important one. So how do we provide cues? One notion on this has been to allow display of personal information in the room. That's another important point in the home, the display of meaningful content. Sometimes it's books, sometimes it's photos, sometimes it's objects. Trying to do the same thing in the institution. Memory boxes, another technique, so people can identify their room. They begin to see things of theirs, if you will, outside the room. And some interesting work from a colleague of mine, Maggie Calkins, she suggests that 3D objects actually work more effectively than photos. And most importantly, have the resident choose it not the family, is critical. And so then, I wanted to show this too. So then a lot of times we're going with private rooms. How do you begin to promote socialization? Here's an intriguing point of just a window seat, right? How do we begin to design that? We're used to seeing them anyway. It allows the place for someone to come visit and engage with the person. It also provides an additional storage space underneath. To talk a little bit about how we go about this design process, I'm going to talk really briefly about the bathing issue, which is really huge with older adults. It's one of the top reasons why people eventually get institutionalized. Bathing, incontinence, big issues. So this is actually a sales photo, okay? So this is for the lift and tub combination. Now, if we just think about it, so this is the sales photo. But what are they showing here? They're showing someone that if they're going to go in the tub, and notice there's no water right now in there, but the advantage of this lift is you could put them into some tub that's already temperate. But what do? You're with somebody you don't know. You're going to be dangled in the air, right? And then dumped into the tub, right? Bathing is one of the most personal, sensual experiences we have. And we have to understand those emotional components and how to deal with that. And again, this is a sales photo. I can show you some really horrific photos from some skilled nursing where this is often a very cold room, spacious. You can see it's very much driven from kind of an institutional mindset, right? And how do you begin to personalize it? So we came up by focusing on the idea of these attributes we wanted to create. We wanted to create a sense of stimulation. We wanted to create a sense of safety and privacy and continuity with previous experiences. So one design idea we promoted was a calming place to bathe. And you can see some of the things we do. It doesn't all happen in one room. There's that idea of soft transitions, a place for where you disrobe, a place where afterwards you groom, right? There's these subtle commitments. Then you would commit into a bathing area and allow that sense of making that decision over time, that softer transition to this. And then how do you really craft that into a very personal kind of space? This one begins to move in the way on this, right? So you can begin to see the a personal grooming space associated with it. You can kind of begin to see the colors, the daylight being allowed to be in there, different style tub here, right? So this one, what's the drawback on this one, on this tub? The drawback on this one is, yes, you can get in, but there's nothing filled. So it's not a typical bath experience because then the tub fills as you're sitting in there, right? So there's an oddity to that, but still, you can begin to have a sense that they're thinking about the experience. And then really quickly, I'll just talk about kind of where my work has focused the last couple of years, which is more on the community or neighborhood level, and where we try and what we're trying to do for healthy aging. So one of the things for healthy aging is how do you enable people to stay engaged? How can they be? How can you promote their capability to be independent? And so we know that neighborhoods that generate diversity and activity have 4 characteristics, and one is mixed use. So our typical suburban environment does not do that, right? So how close is it you can get to, whether it's shopping, your bank, what have you? ATM, I guess, right, is really the need now. Short connected blocks shouldn't be surprising. If you've been to Portland, you should be able to recognize that that's a very walkable city because of its short blocks. To say that something's 2 blocks away in Portland is a lot different than saying that something's 2 blocks away in my Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City has huge blocks. Okay, 2 blocks away is like, well, okay, we better take the car, right? And in Portland, 2 blocks, easy. So short connected blocks is really important. Mix of buildings. Now what they're talking about there is that if everything's new, there's a certain kind of rent that's required of that. And so what you're actually taking a look for is an area that would have some older buildings, might be able to have some cheaper rents, newer buildings, and so you begin to have this mix that can begin to happen. And then density, which we've talked about, and kind of the universal question and ubiquitous question in urban design is, okay, what's the right density? And it's going to vary for people about what that is. And as I understand it, there's like a new building in Pullman that's creating some issues about density, right? Something downtown, it's going to be like 5 stories or something, right? So I'm sure there's some issues there going on. And then you can see some of these other issues as well. What I'd really talk about in terms of presence and quality of sidewalks is kind of the key outcome is connectivity. Can you connect in ways where you can walk and bike? So we continue to build these types of things. You're more likely to see these characteristics in this type of an environment. Here are 4 essential functions within a 10-minute walk that's been identified. You can begin to see new neighborhoods are being designed more and more with multi-use. So hopefully you can see some single residential, you can see some townhomes, so they're kind of clustered together, greater density. You can see apartments and businesses being clustered together. One of the things in existing neighborhoods that's always controversial, but might be adopted in places, is if you have the ability to create another space on your property as like a granny flat, something that can be host when you're perhaps initially, maybe it's your child when they first get out of college and say, hey, mom and dad, I'm back, right? And that's where they are. But maybe when the seniors also age, maybe that's a place that they can more effectively live as well. So it gives greater flexibility to what happens. Here's this idea of connectivity. This is actually from a co-housing unit. And I don't have time to talk about co-housing, but it's kind of a trend in senior living. And so you can begin to see the allowance here for bike paths and sidewalks that begin to allow connectivity. And we shouldn't dismiss the idea of biking for older adults out of hand. I had a sabbatical in Lund, Sweden, and I can tell you that was the common mode of transportation quite often for people that still had that ability. A trend you see in urban design is the idea of complete streets. How do you begin to make it safe for someone to walk and so forth? So creating more buffers so that it's designed not just for moving traffic as fast as we can, but bicyclists, pedestrians, and so forth. And one of the big issues is, we mentioned the term food service or food desert before, is we have all sorts of service deserts for folks. How can I get the services I need, particularly if I live in a suburban environment? And one of the trends that's emerging with older adults is the village-to-village network. So this is where local seniors begin to partner together and begin to say, either begin to pay someone to help them do it or partner to do it. So let's say someone still has the ability to drive to the grocery store. How can they begin to help out their neighbors that might not have that capability? And maybe the neighbor is able to do something else. Maybe the neighbor is able to tailor, sew, right? Repair clothing, what have you. And so you're seeing this emerge more and more across the country. So think about what those service deserts are and how technology might enhance that. I think could be really a useful one. Independence enhancing technologies. I show a photo of an old iPhone. And one of the amazing things I think there is just simply the ability to do this, right? So the ability for someone to change that scale at which they engage has really been, I can tell you from my mother-in-law, has kind of changed her life. How she accessed digital technology prior to that, and now that she can do that, it's really changed things. It says, wow, it's responsive to me. And then one thing I wanted to hit here, because I think this is something else technology might be able to address that we're losing from person-to-person contact. So WSU actually was the founder of a nationwide movement called the Gatekeeper Program. This was about 20 years ago. And what that was is we would train people that checked your gas meters, your mail carriers, things like that, to check in on older adults in the neighborhood. And when we begin to have less and less of that happening, how are we checking on older adults? So as it would come, they could begin to take a look at any maintenance issues, look inside the house, whatever. In really bad cases, is there hoarding behavior going on, whatever. But they'd be able to begin to respond to some of those issues. So I just want to highlight 3 quick frameworks that I kind of presented that I would hope could stimulate some creativity for you as you think about interventions. This being one. So if you think about physical setting as being technology, Really focus on what are the goals or the experiential attributes you want to achieve. Is it about safety? Is it about privacy? Is it about whatever it is about? What is the activity? And realize that people will be engaged in that, but they also do it within their socio-cultural context. And so one of the things colleagues of mine in Sweden addressed that I think is really important for technology is I mentioned gender differences. And one of the things they found in Sweden was that if you gave someone a walker, a different kind of technology, but an assistive technology, they found that the females tended to view that as independence enhancing. And they tend to have the males view it as expressing dependence. That is profoundly different, okay? And who is likely to adapt to that technology and use it the way we want? So those kind of things are really quite important. I'll go back to this model just to have you recognize that we're dealing with a narrower range of ability. You know, what is the environmental range that they can operate within? I would say the same is true for technology, and really trying to figure out how to hit that sweet zone. And what we need to recognize is that the more we design technology that can serve this level that's on the so-called lower competence level, you're really serving a wider range of people. Generally speaking, everybody else will be able to adapt to that and utilize it. So it's kind of the great challenge paradigm, I think, for smart technology. And then the theory of allostatic load, that I think one of the things you always want to think about is what is the stress that's being created or alleviated through your technological designs. If it's building stress, chances are it's not where we want to be going, and how does it begin to alleviate stress? And particularly how we can time those kind of interventions that alleviate stress for people so that as their daily stress level raises, they actually get some relief to that. That's really a pretty important one, I think, that could be dealt with. And then I'll leave you with one final slide here that I just mentioned, that when we design for older adults, chances are we are actually designing for a broader population. When we think about curb cuts for wheelchairs, we're actually enabling the mom with the stroller. So we're really designing for a wide range of abilities. And then I'll leave with this final quote, that a small improvement in environmental quality can make all the difference in the world to a person with limitations and competence. And that's really what it's about. Don't worry about what are necessarily the big changes. Sometimes just the smallest change can make all the difference in the world. So that's what I have for you.